welcome back. I'm Michael Stamatinos, your host for the Advancing Healthcare Innovation Show. And if you're new to us, we're absolutely crazy passionate about healthcare innovation and adoption. And our aim is to bring real stories from real people that are innovating every single day within healthcare. And if you've checked out a number of our earlier webcasts and posts, we've just got a phenomenal year that's been action-packed with new content, amazing stories. And I'm absolutely delighted today to bring a fantastic person. We've had a couple conversations, but I'm just really excited about Dr. Chip Grant, who is the founder and CEO of Watershed Health. Dr. Grant, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Michael. Glad to be with you.
Awesome. So I want to maybe dive in initially to kind of unravel a little bit of your background, because I think your story is quite remarkable, being a clinician and sort of transitioning into the entrepreneurship path. Can you maybe share with the audience a little bit about your story and how Watershed Health kind of came to be?
Sure. Well, I'm an interventional cardiologist, and I was practicing in Mobile, Alabama back in 2009, 2010, 2011. And, you know, some of your viewers will know that in October of 2012, the hospital readmission penalty was born. And it started small, and the idea is it was going to scale up. But it was really sort of the first effort from CMS, or it was, you know, that this thing that was happening to patients after hospitalizations was a really significant problem. It was a big problem financially, but it was also a big problem in terms of health outcomes, because what they were seeing is patients who were having readmissions to the hospital were not doing well in terms of morbidity and mortality, even when you correct for lots of other things. Now, the truth is that I really was kind of oblivious to that, because I was busy putting stents in people who were having heart attacks and hadn't really given it too much thought. And this is sort of one of these interesting things that happens in life that you don't expect. But I had a patient, I remember her very well, who I really got to know in clinic. I liked her a lot, interesting person. And I had her in the hospital for a very tough procedure, a high-risk procedure, somehow got through it, discharged her from the hospital. She went out into the post-acute world, and a few days later came back with a clot that had formed in the stent that I put in, or one of the stents that I put in. And it turns out that some of the medicine that she was supposed to be on, even though we wrote a prescription for it and we made sure that it was going to be available to her, the message had gotten lost in the translation between the hospital and the post-acute phase. She hadn't taken the medicine and she nearly died. And it really got me, I think that was my initial sort of, this is not good. But, you know, being a cardiologist and probably having a little bit of an oversized ego, I thought, well, that's okay. We can fix this. I can fix this from the hospital. So we put together a kind of a little committee and did an RCA to try to figure out what happened. And we made some changes in the hospital. And I went back to being a cardiologist. And around 3 months later, a similar patient had a similar event, despite all of the things that we had done in the hospital. And it really kind of rocked my world. And at that point, I started to look beyond the hospital and got really interested in trying to understand better the things that were happening in the post-acute phase. as I got into it and sort of learned more and more about it and looked at the literature, but more importantly, looked at root causes of why patients were having these adverse outcomes in the post-acute phase, it was really an incredible eye-opener for me, because first of all, as I read through the literature and I looked at what folks were saying about why patients were having adverse outcomes in the post-acute phase, I realized that a lot of what I thought, based on what other people thought, was incorrect. I realized that CMS was at least based on value-based purchasing and the hospital readmission penalty. CMS wasn't really on the right track either. I realized that, and there's actually now some reasonably good literature describing this, but that that hospitals really have very little to say about what happens when patients leave. Now, if you look at the hospital readmission penalty and the way a lot of payers approach this, that's not intuitive, because everybody sort of come at the hospitals with these big sticks, little carrots and big sticks, and said, fix this, get this right. But that's, that, and despite all the things that hospitals have done, we know that just hasn't worked out. But so here I am, interventional cardiologist, having a good time practicing medicine, but really kind of faced with this reality, which is there's this problem in the post-acute space. There didn't seem to be an understanding, or I hadn't run into anybody who had really seemed to understand the problem. And then when I started to look for solutions and looking at services and technologies, because in my opinion, the problem wasn't well understood, the solutions were all sort of off the mark. My plan was I was just going to go find a solution or two and go to the CEO of the hospital and say, hey, let's get this so that we stop having patients, readmit to the hospital or worse. And there just wasn't anything. And that's where Watershed came from.
Isn't that interesting though? Isn't that interesting how, first of all, thank you for sharing that, but it's interesting to know that the pathway to solution came from understanding the problem at such a deep level. And what I have seen to date out in the marketplace are solutions that are surface level solutions. They haven't necessarily gone down 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 layers deep to fully understand the full environment of what it is that they're trying to solve. And it just sounds like, because this was sort of a hyper-personalized situation, that this meant something to you, and which means that when there isn't a solution that's out there and you're looking for one, it only means one thing: you're the one that has to solve it.
Yeah, you gotta quit your day job. Which I didn't quit my day job right away. I was a little bit naive and thought that, we'll just spin up a health tech company in my spare time. But truly, and it's not to pick on any of the existing solutions or solutions that were there at the time, but when when you sort of run into that moment where where there's clarity about what's needed, but the problem hasn't been solved, it really was sort of a choice, which was, okay, am I just going to go back to putting in stents and sending people home and doing CPR on them in the ER, or are we going to try to solve this problem? And so anyway, that was 2013.
So it's been a long road, and I know there've been probably a series of ups and downs, and you guys have gone about this in your way, because I don't think there's one conventional way. What was the tipping point that you felt like, we really have something here, And who took a chance on Watershed first? Who do we need to give some praises to?
Boy, there's a long list. So again, because you're not talking to a serial entrepreneur, you're talking to a clinician. The way I approached this was the way that I knew how to approach a problem like this, which was I had a hypothesis. There was an intervention. We designed an intervention, which was this platform, and the question was, could we make could we improve outcomes? But then there was a second question. I'll explain that. And really, that was the bigger question. It's funny looking back, but it's really the truth. So we decided that we were going to build this platform, spend a bunch of my money on building this platform, and then we were going to test it. We were going to take it to a single hospital and test it. And I promise you, this is a fact. Had the platform not worked, I would have abandoned it, because again, as a clinician, as somebody who doesn't prescribe a medicine unless it's effective, I just figured we'll see. It seems like a good idea. It seems like a reasonable hypothesis. But, medicine tells us that we have lots of good ideas and reasonable hypotheses that don't turn out to be true. I did a big clinical trial in my fellowship and after my fellowship that I thought was going to change the way that we managed renal insufficiency in the cath lab. And it turned out to be a big zero. And so, you just have to know that. So I went to Spring Hill Hospital in Mobile, Alabama, small, relative, medium-sized hospital. And I met with them, the CEO, a guy named Jeff St. Clair, and I told him what we wanted to do. Like everyone else, they were experiencing the beginnings of the hospital readmission penalties. So they were, like everyone else, focused on trying to solve the problem, not only for, I would say, secondary, the financial piece being secondary. I think they wanted to do right by their patients. And so they were willing to take a chance on us, and they gave us great cooperation, their tech people and the clinical people. We worked with their case manager director, a woman called Michelle Allen, who was really, really innovative in her thinking. And we launched the thing. And 6 months later, we sat down and really said, okay, here we go. Is this, did I just waste a bunch of money and a bunch of time? And it turned out that the platform did everything we hoped it would and more. We had known from everybody there are a lot of claims in this space, but when you go to the science and you look at, especially if somebody funds something, like when the NIH funds a study, even if it doesn't work, you have to publish it. Well, if you look at kind of the post-acute intervention literature, you'll see that there are some nuggets out there where people have had to actually publish the kind of the thing. And so, when you see a small improvement in readmissions based on intervention services, usually, navigators or coaches or even home health services or doctors, if you see a couple of % improvement in readmissions, it's a really big deal. And lots of times you don't see anything. And there's some classic studies where they've thrown the kitchen sink at the problem and haven't made an impact. And so when we sat down and looked at the outcomes, we realized that we were really on to something. And at that point, that's when I knew, okay, we're going to have to think about expanding this beyond just the single hospital.
Now, I know that your initial model, you talk about, to me, I'll just back up a second. When you first initially sort of explained what you were doing, I think in visions. I thought of a paddle boat. I love going whitewater rafting, but I think of all these different people that are on the boat that all have paddles. And it's not just one paddle, it's everyone paddling and working together, navigating through some of these treacherous rapids. And everyone has a paddle. So it sounds like what you've done with your solution is you've given everyone a paddle, and you've given everyone access to actually start the paddle. And you're kind of calling things out and steering things. Can you maybe talk a little bit about what it means to provide people access to your platform and what that's done in terms of the coordination and delivery of care?
First of all, I'm sorry that we're on this podcast webinar with with that metaphor, because I'm going to steal it, and I don't want people to have such easy evidence of where it came from.
Take it. I freely give it away.
Well, I appreciate it. We may need to get that in writing, Michael, but
it's being recorded.
That's a great metaphor, and I use them all the time, and I love that. So here's what I figured out. Here's what I figured out when I got obsessed with this back in 2013. What I figured out was, first of all, there were a lot of platforms out there that enabled care coordination, right? Care coordination is possible. Everybody's got a paddle, okay? There was no lack of paddles. We had tools that enabled inter-provider communication, where we could securely communicate with one another. We had tools where we were supposed to be sharing key documents. We all know about the idea behind the health information exchanges. We also understand that that didn't work out so well. We have platforms that make it possible to follow care pathways so that we're not kind of making it up as we go along when it comes to disease management, management of heart failure, diabetes, and so forth. So there was no lack of platforms out there, even when I initially started looking at this. What I realized was when I started to look at sort of the root causes of these failures was that it was a lack, it was discoordination. It was a lack of coordinated behaviors, and that the truth is that when I was looking at what was missing, it wasn't like 60 things or 50 things. It was like 4 things. There were, there were basically 4 behaviors that providers needed to do in order to ensure successful outcomes. And when those things happened, patients did all right, or they did as well as they could. I mean, patients are going to have adverse outcomes. These are people coming out of the hospital are typically high risk for adverse outcomes, but communication, data sharing around, key things. Hey, I just changed the medication on this patient. Maybe you'd like to know since you're involved in their care. So communication, data sharing, and then again, following guideline-based care pathways. So not making it up as you go along, but treating the diseases the same way. And then organizations that learn from their mistakes, organizations that do performance improvement. Those were the characteristics that we knew led to better outcomes. And there were, lots of data for that. We knew that there were lots of platforms out there that made it possible to do those things. But for some reason, those things just weren't happening, despite the fact that there was the potential for them to happen. So the big idea of
what got in the way?
Great question. So you hear a lot about perverse incentives. or misaligned incentives. You know, if I'm a small hospice agency or a home health agency, okay, and you know, and it's not like I've got huge margins and I'm charging $100 for something that cost me $2. I mean, I'm running on relatively tight margins anyway, and I'm out in the healthcare space, and now I've got to not only take care of patients, but I've got to go and drum up business from hospitals and other providers. You know, I've got to have marketing and sales. I've also got all this regulatory stuff going on, and now CMS is telling me I have to fill out all these things. And the reality is I think that post-acute providers have had a lot on their plates. Now, certainly lately, especially with COVID, it's been exponentially more. But I think that we just we weren't incentivizing providers to focus on the things that mattered. And so as a result, we weren't getting the levels of those behaviors that are needed to optimize outcomes. And so the big idea with Watershed was, okay, what if we created a platform that made it possible for all this stuff to happen? We're going to make it possible for Chip to communicate with Michael about a patient that we're taking care of together. We're going to make it possible for us to share key data. Here's a medication reconciliation, Michael, that you're going to want to see because you're about to take over the care of this patient, or hey, you need an EKG. Here's the EKG for this patient. We're going to make it possible for us to follow care pathways together so that we're able to deliver consistent care. We're going to make it possible for you and I to do QA together, quality assurance work. If you and I are managing a patient together and the patient winds up back in the hospital, let's figure out together what happened and see if we might not repeat that. So that was part one. What if we built a platform that made it possible to do all these things? But part two was the bigger question, which was, could we create a platform that naturally incentivized those behaviors and promoted those behaviors? Could we, in effect, create a positive feedback loop so that the more that the more that we do these behaviors, the better the patient outcome, and perhaps we could figure out a way to drive that positive feedback loop. And the way the idea that we had was, what if we measured those behaviors within the platform as users use the platform, and then we created metrics, kind of like the CMS stars ratings, except our metrics would be real time, and they would describe the things that we had learned lead to optimal patient outcomes. And then if Chip's trying to pick a healthcare organization, and I have, Michael's organization and Fred's and Sally's, I'm going to use this information to pick the organization that is best for this patient. And in doing so, I'm going to naturally promote the organizations that are doing this behavior, which means that the organizations kind of have a decision to make. The organizations can say, well, you know what, we're going to continue to do what we've been doing, and maybe we'll try to get business from our partners from hospitals by, bringing them breakfast, or maybe our relationships, because I've known somebody, but the other choice will be organizations will say, well, wait a minute, this isn't that hard. In order for us to earn these metrics that are going to get us more business, all we have to do is communicate, share data, follow care pathways, and do quality assurance. And so the thing that we were interested in when we sat down after we did this 6-month pilot at Spring Hill Hospital was not really could we improve outcomes, because we knew that outcomes correlate with these behaviors. The big question was, could a technology platform in and of itself change provider behavior? And we were very, very relieved to see that yes, that's exactly what happened. So while we ultimately got better outcomes in this community, that wasn't the exciting part. The exciting part is that we could create this virtuous cycle. And so
you know
anyway,
how hard it is. You know how difficult it is to get clinicians to kind of corral them. It's like herding cats. So what was interesting to me when you had initially shared this was, number one, I thought of like a couple words. I thought of access, the fact that you are eliminating any friction towards access, whether it's access to data, communication, being able to do real-time collaboration. And furthermore, it was around this notion about creating a token economy. And that when you focus on the right behaviors and you're doing those over and over again, naturally, it's just only that you're going to get better results. The outcomes are going to align with what it is you do when you do the right behaviors. And the fact that you figured this out, and quite frankly, in such a short amount of time, is remarkable. It's remarkable.
Well, you know, it's really it really sort of goes back to what you talked about initially, which was when you begin to understand the problem, designing the solution isn't quite as bad. I will tell you, and I sent you that little letter to the editor
Let's talk about that.
That I did with Rich Milani. But you know, it's really a little bit controversial. So just to get everybody else up to speed, in 2013, when I started looking at this, one of the things that everybody was really excited about and kind of obsessed with was patient activation or patient engagement. And the epiphany was that patients that were engaged or activated around their own wellness or health did better. And there's a woman called Judith Hibbard who published just a tremendous amount of literature and actually came up with this PAM model or score. And it's a beautiful thing. And what it shows is that patient engagement is very important. It correlates with literally almost anything you can think of in terms of health outcomes. It's measurable, and importantly, it's changeable. And so at the time, there was kind of this notion, and there still is, that, you know, it's the patient's fault. And that if we could just get these patients to act right and to not, you know, smoke and drink and wear their seatbelts, and, you know, these patients, if we could just get them all to act right and do and engage, we wouldn't have any of these problems. And that's not wrong in chronic disease management. And certainly if I sort of had a magic lever as a clinician, and I can only change one thing to improve health outcomes for someone in chronic disease management, I would fully engage them. I would give them a PAM score of 4, and that would be great. But the post-acute phase is an interesting time, and it turns out if you look at adverse outcomes, in this period of time where patients go from being, you know, in the hospital with just the crazy routines that go on in the hospital. I mean, hospitals literally induce psychosis in normal people. There's some really interesting studies that show that people's IQs, when they're measured at the end of a hospitalization, and then you measure them, you know, after discharge later when they get back to normal, their IQs are relatively lower at the point of discharge, which means that they're, you know, blaming the patient in this very vulnerable post-acute time is convenient, but it turns out that it just doesn't pan out. It turns out that if you sort of attribute blame and you do it correctly, it's the providers that are dropping the ball. And so Dr. Milani and I wrote a little thing about the fact that, we ought to be talking about provider engagement here. And we ought to be thinking about what we can do to measure and promote provider engagement, because that's what we're talking about, right, Michael? I mean, if you're taking care of a patient and you're not communicating and not sharing data timely and not doing QA and not following guidelines, you're not an engaged provider, and the patient's going to have a suboptimal outcome. And obviously, if the opposite is true, you're going to, the patient's going to do as well as they can. And so it's interesting, though, if you go to PubMed, and anybody who sees this should try it, do a PubMed search for patient activation or patient engagement, and you're going to see like 70,000 hits. Go look at provider engagement, and it's crickets. I mean, it's like not a lot there. So it's kind of physician heal thyself. I think that's where the opportunity is in post-acute care, and that's really what we're trying to promote is provider engagement.
Fantastic. Well, I know we're kind of coming towards the end of our time here, and how can people follow Watershed closely, keep up to date with you? Give us some things that you guys are excited about in the future, and just kind of maybe take this time a little bit to kind of promote yourselves. I know that you're a pretty humble guy, but platform's yours.
Well, we've been, sort of despite the fact that we've never had, we've never placed a lot of effort or resources in terms of marketing and sales and so forth. That's slowly but surely changing. Fortunately, I told you I'm not a serial entrepreneur, but I'm now surrounded by some folks that have a better sense of that. And so we now have a social media presence, so folks can follow us on Twitter and see what we're up to. We're also expanding quite a bit, thanks to some partnerships with health plans. We've been able to expand beyond one hospital to a health system, and now really across the whole state of Alabama. So at this point, we're working with more than 1,000 providers with millions of patient interactions happening annually, and at this point, we're now branching out beyond even the Southeast into the Midwest and some other things. And so we will continue to make sure that we talk about those things when we can. But our mission is to help people feel better and live longer. That's something that I used to tell residents and fellows when they were training, and one of these young doctors would say, "Oh, I want to do this. I want to try this." And I would say, hold on a second. Is the thing you just said either going to make this patient feel better or live longer? Because if not, we're not doing it. And I think for us, that's what it's all about, is trying to promote that mission. So anyway, stay tuned, and hopefully you'll have me back sometime, and we can give you an update.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it just sounds like you've deduced this down to, you've simplified it, and you're staying razor focused on those things that you can actually impact. So for some of the other listeners that are on here, there's folks that are also similar to you in your shoes, running a digital health startup. If there's one bit of advice, one golden nugget, one takeaway that you can leave them with, what would that be?
Well, I think for me, it's especially when you give up doing something, like being an interventional cardiologist, make sure you're passionate about the thing that you're going after, because as you said, it's not all up good news, and be prepared to hear the word no a lot, and just keep your head down. This is a tremendous amount of work, but again, if you're passionate about it and your mission is meaningful, it's well worth it.
Right on. Well, Dr. Grant, it's been a pleasure to have you. And for those that have joined, thank you so much. If you found this content helpful for you, would you mind sharing it on your social media? Would you mind commenting on it, liking it? It's always helpful when we can get that level of engagement. And I'm just so grateful when we bring more and more people into the community, because at the end of the day, innovators are doers, people that want to get things done. And what better way to do that than through healthcare innovation? So Dr. Grant, it's been a delight to have you on, and I'm looking forward to our next conversation.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
You bet.